So thank you all very much for attending today. We've had a very interesting preliminary voting to find out more about you. We've got a lot of experience of people being migrants here today. We have two presentations. Ronit Cohen, one of our clinical associates, will be talking for about 20 minutes. After our presentation, you'll be invited to go into breakout groups. If you can't be in a breakout group, because if there's someone here that you don't want to be in a breakout group with, tell Kaz by private messaging in the chat, and they will ensure that you're in a different group to this person. That can be the case where there's colleagues or supervisees and therapists and things like this. So otherwise, just enjoy the discussion and the presentations. There'll be two breakout rooms, and there'll be a comfort break after the first breakout group. So please, Ronit, let's go for it. Have you got rights to share? No, you haven't. I'll make you co-host, and then you can share your screen.
Thanks. First of all, I rarely use my laptop for Zoom, so I realize that my picture's quite fuzzy, but at my age, I guess it's a blessing. So I'm going to share screens with you and just sort of do it properly. Oh, no, I can't. Let me just, technical issues. So let's start again.
There we are, we have that, great.
Okay, great. I picked a subject close to my heart, queer migration from the East to the West. It's the experience of many of my clients, and in a much lesser way, mine too. It's the experience of the queer migrants that we're likely to see in our practices. I'm using my privilege and the voice I've been given to speak on their behalf. It's really scary. It's such a diverse group that I'm constantly picturing each and every one of them jumping up and crying, but this isn't my experience, and they'll all be right. I've got a confession to make. When I was reading, when I was asked by Dominic to make that speech, to make this presentation, I was reading Salman Rushdie's The Ground Beneath Her Feet, and I was reading this paragraph, and that became the inspiration for the talk. Disorientation is the loss of the East. Ask any navigator. The East is what you sail by. Lose the East and you lose your bearings, your certainties, your knowledge of what is and what may be, perhaps even your life. Where was that star you followed to the manger? That's right, the East orients. Queer migration is a process where both East and West are distorted. It's one where the migrant's identity is reshaped and then lost in translation. It's a process of disorientation brought on by complex transformations. It's a complex process of trauma. The traumas of the past collide with new traumas. It's hard to find help that can contain such complexity. I've used composite stories, and I'm not going to name countries. I've assigned random names, except in one case where I've borrowed my grandmother's given name, Nadra, to honor her, a Yemeni Arab Jew and a migrant. I don't know what her sexual orientation was. She died when I was 10, but one of her sons, my uncle, was queer. Before I came here, everything negative was so huge and overwhelming. It eclipsed everything else. It was all I could see. It was what home looked like to me. London seemed like the promised land. Now that I've had a reality check, I'm able to see what I couldn't see when I was back home. Migration involves leaving some of your past behind and hoping for a better future. Leaving the people and places you love and moving to a place full of strangers is scary. Migrants use distortion to make it easier. They magnify the negative in their country of origin and erase the positive. It's self-soothing. They idealize their destination to reduce their fear of the unknown. When the migrant reaches their destination, a reciprocal distortion begins. Distortion happens through ignorance and applying a Western context to Eastern experiences. A common Western distortion is to view queer migration as a move from repression to liberation. There are inequalities as well as opportunities everywhere. They're simply restructured during the process of migration. Ignorance of this is a distortion of both East and West. Ignorance of the East leads some to apply a Western context to the East. This distortion is the basis of white saviorism and of many microaggressions. Many queer migrants find themselves distorted in spaces where they had hoped to be safe. White savior distortions of the East can make it possible for them to show support for oppressors of queer communities. These groups are often oppressors the migrants have personally escaped. Migrants don't need white saviors. They are capable of liberating themselves. The Middle East alone has dozens of LGBT organizations active in the region. They need allies rather than people who infantilize them by fighting their battles on their behalf. Western feminist groups can overwhelmingly focus on white feminism. This distorts expression of feminism and the lived experiences of Eastern women. Queer groups ignore context and distort lived experiences of queerness that don't match their definitions. Queer identities are formed in a context of location and culture. In the West, many don't consider the privilege that shaped their queer identities and lived queer experiences. Context matters. Without it, everything becomes distorted. Eastern queer identities can't always be translated into Western ones. For instance, in many countries, identities will resist the binary and be more fluid. Queer communities can be small and therefore not segregated into their components. You'll find queer people mixing with straight or hetero-flexible allies. Judging or trying to force labels on this fluidity is a distortion. Nadra had a long-term girlfriend back home. Her girlfriend is married and has children. Because of the strict segregation between the sexes in their culture, when Nadra was around, her girlfriend's husband would leave them alone. She would even stay overnight and they'd have sex. Nadra now identifies as bisexual, but didn't label her sexuality back then. Her girlfriend doesn't label herself. There are, of course, many people who do use labels we're familiar with. LGBTQ+, kinky, poly, they tend to be a minority and often middle class and educated. Their freedom is conditional and limited. Living in a hostile culture means existing in bubbles of acceptance and compartmentalizing your queer identity. There can be total freedom within those bubbles, but also a constant fear of discovery by outsiders. Queer physical appearance can make you more vulnerable to attack. In some countries, your neighbors could report you to the police if you're careless enough to have loud sex. Coming out is complex. In many countries, queer people aren't free to reveal their sexual orientation or gender identity. They could be out to their friends and an even wider queer network of acquaintances. They could even be out to strangers in queer or queer-friendly venues, but not to their family. They could be out to their immediate family, but not to their extended family. Even when family members know, social stigma prevents a more public coming out. A very small minority do come out publicly and live lives dominated by their queerness. Legal status and active persecution by the state do not play as big a part in this process as people in the West imagine. Oops, sorry, I need to. Samir still uses his dead name with his parents. He's had top surgery and is on testosterone. He hasn't video called his parents in a very long time because his appearance is now undeniably masculine. He even avoids phone calls and uses text instead because his voice has deepened, but he's running out of excuses. It's important to understand that the East doesn't completely disappear as a context when you move to the West. Your behavior can have consequences for your life here, for contact with your family, and for how safe it is to visit the East. Dalia Al-Faral, a lesbian activist living in the United States and co-founder of Solidarity with Egypt, LGBTQ+, was out on her personal Facebook page. The page was public, but she thought only her friends read it. Then one of her posts went viral and was picked up by Egyptian media. She received many death threats and hate messages. Identity is complex. When your environment has never changed, it's easy to believe that identity is only influenced by internal processes. But context distorts. When migrants are subjected to distortion, it transforms their identity. It slowly changes towards the distorted image in other people's eyes. And this is an example. On the left is the migrant when they're still in their home country. Their main identifiers, which are how society sees them, how their environment sees them, in this case is middle class, Christian, and writer. Something that is not as public is activist and feminist, and then more hidden, bisexual and trans. And then they move to the West. And as you can see, the order changes. So now the prominent things visible to the outside are what has been waiting, dying to come out and be more public: bisexual, feminist, and trans. A bit less important is activist, middle class, and writer. They're still an important part of the identity, but they're second to the first three identifier. The identifier Christian is hidden. It's not really significant to this person's life, but in more sectarian countries, something like this will be one of the first things that people use to identify you. The last list of identifiers is the transformation once someone has been here for a long time. Arab has moved to the first place. And for most people, Arab is synonymous with Muslim. And then there is a new identity that's appeared, which is migrant. Then there are the secondary characteristics: bisexual, trans, activist, and feminist. As you can see, the identifier writer has all but disappeared because the language is no longer relevant where the migrant lives. They've lost their fluency, their ability to express themselves, how they come across. So that's no longer an important part of their identity to the outsider, not to them. The migrants' identity transformations can gradually transform the relationship with those left behind. In the West, they're freer to express themselves in a way that was dangerous in the East. This can lead to disapproval or even rejection by families. The West distorts. Subtle transformations can be almost imperceptible here. They feel safe, but the East distorts too. Every nuance is magnified. It's hard to hide on a Zoom call. There is further disorientation. Engaging in activism here could endanger families and friends back home. Being forced to keep so much secret from them means they don't know who you really are and can't celebrate your achievements. Walid is an accomplished and highly respected expert specializing in Eastern queer human rights. They're not out to their family about their gender and sexuality or their work. Their many public appearances are done without being named and with no cameras. This is done to protect them and their family, who are still in the East. Their family views them as a failure because they're only spoken in very vague terms about their work, and also because they aren't married and don't have kids. Waking up from the distortion of the West is another disorientation. The migrant is confronted with the reality of the West. The hoped for homecoming and sense of belonging are shattered. The migrant is once again an outsider, distorted by Western eyes. They are defined by otherness. Migrants who can visit home face another disorientation. They return transformed in a way their friends and families can't relate to. They feel like strangers in their own home, out of touch, in a place that has transformed during their absence, just like they have. They're strangers, alienated. They've lost the East. Queer migrant trauma is complex. There are traumas related to the past that we expect to find in people who've left their homeland for a reason. But they are wrapped up in the trauma of disorientation, which is ongoing. There's the trauma of racism and microaggressions, and that of the gaslighting around them, the trauma of othering, alienation, isolation, transformation, disorientation. Sarah Hegazi, an Egyptian lesbian, committed an act of extreme bravery. She waved a pride flag at a Mashru Leila concert in Cairo in 2017. Mashru Leila is a Lebanese band whose singer is openly gay. Sarah was imprisoned and tortured. She was later granted asylum in Canada. Deeply traumatized, she felt alienated and isolated in exile, but couldn't return to Egypt for fear of being arrested. She took her own life in 2020, age 30. There's also the trauma of witnessing and experiencing traumas still happening back home. Experiencing trauma from afar can be more devastating than when you're there because of isolation, because of not being in the same space with people experiencing the same trauma together. In countries where trauma is not unusual, it becomes part of the culture. This shared context is holding. There's collective trauma, collective defenses, healthy or not, collective grief and collective healing. Disorientation means being excluded from that. There's the trauma of having suffered queerphobia. It doesn't go away just because the real danger has been left behind. The hypervigilance remains, but its source isn't always immediately obvious. The experience of safety in the West can be overwhelming and scary. It can make hypervigilance go into overdrive because there are so many things that register as dangers. There's the trauma of internalized queerphobia. It can be deeply hidden under layers of a confident and outgoing queer identity. It still leads to shame, fear, and guilt. The trauma we as therapists find hardest to talk about is trauma caused by therapists. Therapists who make assumptions about your context or about you based on their own distortions of the East. Therapists who encourage you to come out because they can't see the context in which coming out is the wrong choice. Therapists who gaslight you when you try to talk about microaggressions, who try and help you change the way you frame things instead of validating and addressing racial trauma. When I was experiencing an acute mental health crisis due to the trauma I suffered back home, I was referred to an Asian women's domestic violence support organization. I'm queer and single and had never experienced domestic violence. No one could hear or see me. Nilam. How do we meet our migrant clients' complex needs in therapy? We have to challenge our misconceptions so that we truly see them. If we're not migrants, we need to check our privilege. We need to be curious about the experience of disorientation. We need to challenge our own distortions. We need to explore our clients' queer migrant trauma. We have to take care not to force our own context on them. We should respect their boundaries, even if we consider them harmful. We need to ask ourselves why we see them as harmful. Are we making assumptions? Are we using our own privileged position to judge them? Are we distorting the context? We must remember that coming out isn't the Holy Grail. We need to believe our clients and take great care not to gaslight them. We should take great care not to be white saviors, trying to help the queer migrant move from repression to liberation. We're all repressed and liberated in our own ways. If we meet our clients where they are and hear them and see them without distortion, we can help them reduce their sense of disorientation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronit. That was excellent. So welcome to our next speaker of the afternoon, Piotr Miałkowski. I'm delighted to have you with us. We met each other a long time ago, maybe about 15 years ago, I think. And I fell in love with you because of your lovely sparkly eyes and your very interesting points in our conversations during the training. So I'm looking forward to this immensely and look forward to just take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dominic, for your introduction. I am delighted to be invited to participate in the Pink Therapy webinar, as I have been very keen supporter of your organization for many years, and meeting you a long while ago, it was really a pleasure. Like Ronit, I just have to say that there are a lot of problems. Well, I'm not very technologically minded, so please, Kaz will be just changing my slides for me, and I will be just carrying on with my talk. So the slide 1. Hi everyone, my name is Piotr Miałkowski. I was born in Poland and moved to the UK in my mid-20s. I will be 60 this year, and so I've lived in this adopted country of mine for over half of my life. I'm a psychotherapist, and until the COVID-19 pandemic, I have worked from my practice in North London, but now I worked exclusively online from home, so I'm completely stationary. In fact, this is where I'm speaking to you from right now. I live in Hertfordshire together with my husband, who was my sole reason for leaving Poland. My husband, also a migrant originally from Kolkata in India, a talented young nuclear physicist, was recruited by a British university during the so-called brain drain of the early 1970s, which brought Indian scientists to the UK. So, as you can see, migration is my lived experience. In one respect, my husband and I are in a privileged position, as we were crossing frontiers out of choice. Many migrants seek refuge in the UK out of fear for their own safety and even for their lives. Some are escaping persecution, instability and war, or choosing to move here in search of better living conditions, freedom of expression and acceptance, as it's the case with many queer migrants. I have been lucky to meet many of them personally, some of whom are now my friends and colleagues. A large number of the clients I have worked with over the past 30 years are gender, sexuality, relationship diverse people who migrated to the UK for one reason or another. Let's go to slide number 2. I'm not an academic, so my talk today is rather a down-to-earth exploration based on a multitude of personal experiences of queer migration. Over the years, I have learned to appreciate that migration, far from being a simple and straightforward passage of relocation, is instead a complex and complicated process, and can be traumatic even after we have reached the shores of our promised land. This is indeed reflected in the title of today's webinar, Freedom to be Queer in the UK, at what cost? Queer migration is a very precarious process. Yes, I really do mean it, very precarious, as it is a process full of danger and uncertainties, the toll of which is largely underestimated. However, more recently, especially in academic circles which are influenced by queer theory and gender studies, more attention has been paid to this phenomenon, an example of which was last November's conference, Queer Migrations, Transnational Sexualities in Theory and Practice, organized by University of Cambridge and CRUSH, Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. Recordings of some presentations from this conference are still available online, and I highly recommend them. Slide number 3, please. The demands of migration almost inevitably lead to each of us taking many unexpected and even momentous decisions. This statement relates mostly to refugees and asylum seekers fleeing war-torn countries, violence and persecution, including sexual and gender-based violence, who arrive in the UK seriously traumatized and may experience problems with mental and physical health and expect from their host country, the UK, much more than just a warm welcome, but protection and support. However, this agony is not limited only to these extreme cases, as the vast majority of individuals who migrate experience multiple stresses that evidently impact their mental well-being, including the loss of family and loss of social support systems, loss of means of financial support, loss of language, status, and so-called cultural bereavement due to the loss of cultural and religious customs and connections. Now, before I proceed any further, I want to offer you a brief explanation of how I use the terms queer and migrant in my brief talk, but also in relation to myself and my journey through life so far. So let us show you the slide number 13, if possible, Kaz. Thank you. I use the word migrant to refer to anyone who moved from one country to another in order to settle temporarily or permanently. I make no distinction among legal immigrants, refugees and asylum seekers, economic or undocumented immigrants. It has been shown that such distinctions do not reflect empirically verifiable differences among migrants, who often shift from one category to another. I also strongly believe that this type of divisions are most often imposed by the political regimes and general public in order to restrict the migrants' rights, and are in fact part of their surveillance and control. Can we go back one slide to slide number 12? My use of the term queer will require a slightly longer explanation, as my choice here, at least partly, is linked to my process of leaving the country of my birth and settling in the UK. Well, until recently I was happily identifying myself as a gay man. Since my teens, being gay not only indicated my sexual orientation, but also emblematized my choice of alternative lifestyle and my dress code, and my choice of shoes. In my early 20s, when Poland was still ruled by the communist regime, I would parade through the streets of Warsaw in my favorite bright red leather knee-high boots. And I can assure you that wearing red leather boots was not a part of communist propaganda on my part. Instead, it was my gay way of demonstrating to the entire world that I was different, and in the equal measure, the expression of my gay defiance against the oppressive authorities. Even more importantly, the word gay, that has no clear substitute in Polish language, would have most clearly expressed who I then was as a person. The rebel, the outcast, a foreigner in the country of my birth. Everything would revolve around being gay, that was also simultaneously organizing all the other aspects of my then personal identity. And I had a strong sense that my gay identity was then as firmly fixed as the prevailing political system in my birthplace. However, after my move to the UK, and more recently, as I'm getting older, equipped with all I know about myself and the world, I am more and more inclined to think and talk about myself as queer, as this term seems to address many more facets of my complex nature, including my current philosophical and political stand. After Professor Gayatri Gopinath, a speaker at the 2020 Queer Migrations Conference, I now see queerness as a possibility, a sense of self-knowing, a mode of sociality and relationality. Unlike the term gay, which stands in opposition to straight, and so being unavoidably fixed, queer seems to me to speak to the in-between, embracing all the middle space demarcated by both polar opposites of gay and straight, addressing them both simultaneously. Please, can we go down to slide number 6? Thank you. Now let me return to the main topic of my talk, queer migrations, an experiential inquiry into interweaving multiple identities. You can see here a superb print by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto from the series Tomorrow We Inherit the Earth. Bhutto, who identifies himself as queer, is a well-known Pakistani visual and performance artist who currently lives in San Francisco. Research into queer migrations clearly confirms that the vast changes which ensue in the process of moving from one country to another, and perhaps in particular for a queer person moving to the UK, inevitably involves many significant adjustments in their personal sense of who they are. This includes a sense of personal identity and the intersections of some other aspects of identity, such as gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, religion, language, disability. This is when many migrants grow into profoundly changed selves that they could never have anticipated. For some, being uprooted and moving countries is so traumatic that they never are able to settle down in the UK. As their new country, their lives become temporary arrangements they make, living from their unpacked suitcases, ready for return to the country of origin or moving on somewhere else. English weather doesn't help either. Others might take a new identity, often of their adopted country. They either blend into it, learn the new language, change their accent, name, the way they dress and move, become indistinguishable, often boasting about the superiority of the new culture over the inferiority of their motherland or their own past. The echo of British imperialism and being connected to it by living in the UK strengthens their own weak selves. They are like Cinderella magically turned into a princess. And I'm far from criticizing them for it, because this is rather a necessary adjustment they make into a new situation that helps them to cope in their new life. For others, however, in the initial departure is just the beginning of a journey onto finding their actual identity, dissimilar to their original one, and yet also different from that offered by the new place. The migration acts as a pretext to become dislodged from an established identity of their past that they managed to outgrow a long while before, like it has been in my case. To use the vocabulary taken from Melanie Klein and Object Relations School of Psychotherapy, they move into the depressive position of their overall development. I have been struggling for many years whether to call myself Polish or British Polish, or European, all of which felt somewhat not right. At least in the case of my name, after changing it several times in the past from Piotr to Peter and back, I have eventually settled with Piotr, which feels now like a very different name to the original one given to me by my parents. It seems like this shuttling back and forth in the process of interweaving my multiple identities, triggered by migration, has alerted me to existence of another territory that was invisible to me before, the space beyond the static narratives and identifications, the land of fluidity and freedom. I will have a little bit of water. It seems only fitting to use here the lyrical words of another queer nomad, James Baldwin, from his essay The Devil Finds Work. An identity is questioned only when it is menaced, as when the mighty begin to fall, or when the wretched begin to rise, or when the stranger enters the gates, never thereafter to be a stranger. Identity would seem to be the garment with which one covers the nakedness of the self, in which case it is best that the garment be loose, a little like robes of the desert, through which one's nakedness can always be felt and sometimes discerned. This trust in one's nakedness is all that gives one the power to change one's robes. Slide number 4. So let me state that all migration, and queer migration in particular, cannot be reduced to a mere balance of gains and losses or costs and benefits, as any such a suggestion would do huge disservice to the emotional, cognitive and spiritual upheaval that each and every migrant is faced with, even if many of them rarely talk about their experiences of their own accord, unless in a therapy room or amongst friends in intimate heart-to-heart talks, or like it is in my case in front of all of you, my dear audience. Slide number 5. Now, before I go any further, I would like you to imagine 2 brief scenarios that most migrants have to go through several times a day when already safely in the UK. Most often, this is to do with their appearance, like the color of their skin, their behavior, or how they dress or speak, their foreign look and accent, to put it simply, their difference. Please consider the following scenarios and take a moment to notice your response, your feelings and thoughts and sensations in your body as I talk you through the script on screen now. So this would be, oh great, thank you very much. A stranger asks you, what is your name? You tell them your name. In my case, it's Piotr. A stranger says, oh no, I won't call you that. It's just too difficult. I hope you won't mind if I call you Peter. Please notice your experience. And now another scenario. A stranger asks you, where are you from, Peter? You say, I live here in the UK. A stranger says, no, I mean, where are you really from? Again, notice your feelings, thoughts and sensations in your body. You may share your experience later when in the breakup rooms. This typical moment of ambivalent welcome in the adopted country experienced by the majority of migrants many times a day, every day, has been beautifully depicted by Guyanese-born Canadian writer Tessa McWatt in her debut book, Out of My Skin, which I highly recommend. Even if not dealing specifically with queer migration, McWatt's novel offers a powerful exploration of personal histories of migration, raising questions of identity, race, and belonging, as well as skillful analysis of the effects of colonialism in the New World, specifically in Canada. Slide number 7. This will be a slide with a fragment from this book. When the main character in the book, Daphne, searches for her identity among the lost tribes of contemporary urban life of Montreal and eventually meets her biological aunt Sheila for the first time, Sheila wonders how Daphne responds when people ask her, "Where are you from?" Sheila goes on to say, "I have a friend, a lady from home. She makes me laugh. She says, in this country, it's important to have the proper hyphenation. Funny, makes it sound like having the proper papers. But it's just what you call yourself when someone asks you where you're from. Where are you from? I'm a Canadian. No, I mean, where you from? I've heard that so many times in 30 years. Now you know your hyphenation. West Indian Canadian. What did you used to say? Nothing. I'd say nothing." Please notice the hyphenation is between West Indian, not between West Indian Canadian. For Daphne and Sheila, the insistence in the question, "Where are you from?" reveals the trap of multicultural hyphenation that marks out Black Canadians, in this case, as belonging elsewhere. They have quite literally, in casual conversation, been refused access to the inside of the informal boundaries of Canada, its symbolic breast. A subtle act of exclusion emerges in the repetition and shifting emphasis between the questions, "Where are you from?" to "I mean, where are you from?" This barely detectable meaning indicates the virtually invisible means through which the exclusion of any person of color operates in the entire Western world. Can we go to slide number 14? Just checking. Fantastic, thank you. From my experience in the UK, this behavior is rife. I know about it from my British Indian husband and my Black friends and clients. However, these subtle acts of exclusion do not only apply to people of color, but the vast majority of migrants who, because of their difference, stand out from the so-called native people of their host country. Speaking a different language or speaking with a foreign accent, as I do, wearing unusual clothes or behaving differently to the way that is customary in the UK marks migrants as racialized outsiders, so they are regularly at the same time both greeted and excluded. Queer migrants, the vast majority of whom still viscerally recall violence and harassment experienced in the motherland for being gender-sexual relationship diverse, now are faced with more or less covert rejections and microaggressions in their imagined paradise, the place that they traveled to hundreds, if not thousands of miles in search of safety and freedom. I suggest that we go back to slide number 6. Thank you. To give you an example from my own life in Poland, even if, as I said it earlier, I was not considering leaving the country of my birth until I met my future husband, who happened to live in the UK, I also was the victim of persecution directed against male homosexuals under the communist regime. I still remember it as if it was yesterday, that one early morning in November 1985, at exactly 6 a.m., there was a loud knock on the door of my parents' house, where I then lived, being only 20-something and a psychology student. My mother went to open the door, and a large number of secret police in plain clothes flooded the hallway asking for me. I then recall sitting between two policemen at the back of the van and feeling surprised by some dampness and funny taste on my lips, only to find that a stream of blood was gushing from my nose. I must have been traumatized, as I recall being freezing cold like it would be winter. They took me still in my pyjamas to Mostowski Palace, the notorious headquarters of the secret police in Warsaw, together with about 100 other men. I was kept there for the whole day in the underground cell, interrogated, threatened, and verbally abused for no reason except of my sexual orientation. It was only much later, when already in the UK, that I learned that my arrest was part of an undercover operation codenamed Hyacinth. A beautiful name. In here, Hyacinth is a name of the housewife from the comedy. This operation, conducted by the police was in conjunction with the Secret Service. The aim of the operation was to detain, interrogate, and register both actual and alleged homosexuals in order to create a national database, which resulted in around 11,000 men being registered. The plan was to gather compromising evidence, which would later be used to blackmail those individuals and fight the anti-communist opposition. Homosexuality was then considered in Poland as potentially compromising the communist state. For several years after this incident, I would wake up each and every morning at exactly 6 o'clock, drenched in sweat, with my heart in my mouth. It was clear I was traumatized, and yet I just pushed on with my life as if nothing of any consequence had happened. I know I'm not the only queer person with such an awful experience. I have heard stories like mine, if not worse, many times. The unintended consequence of Operation Hyacinth was that it gave Polish gay people more awareness of their need for equal rights, an example of which was the launch of the Warsaw Gay Movement, the first gay rights organization in Poland. Regrettably, the growing climate of equality was stamped upon by a new government, whose manifesto included referring to LGBT people as more destructive than the communists, who ruled the country for more than 40 years. It was only last year. I would just add the precise number of files in the so-called Pink Archive, as well as its exact location, remains unknown, and despite several attempts on the part of Polish LGBT community, its content is still used to identify and harass the gay men for their political end. Now, can we go to slide number 11? This is to brighten the mood. If you don't know, this is a beautiful painting by Julio Salgado, See Me, I Am a Butterfly. Salgado is a gay Mexican-born artist who grew up in Long Beach, California. Through the use of art, he has become a well-known art activist and uses his art to empower undocumented and queer people by telling their stories and putting a human face to the issue of migration. Now, going back to what I was talking about earlier, like Sheila from the earlier quoted book Out of My Skin, I have also been an immigrant for 30 years, but I'm not black. In addition, I belong to a rather privileged group of professionals who happened to be migrants. I am with Salman Akhtar, a psychoanalyst and prolific American writer on migration, himself originally from northern India, labels an invisible immigrant. Invisible, because I am white, middle class, bilingual, now English speaking, and did not arrive here as a refugee or asylum seeker, and yet my accent defines me as the other. Despite putting my roots in the UK all these years ago and holding British passport for well over 2 decades, I have my share of experiences of being excluded on the basis of my immigrant status. The experiences which have become the building blocks of my hyphenation, Polish-British or British-Pole, or as it is sometimes called double consciousness, which in psychoanalysis refers to the immigrant subjectivity and the related concept of multiplicity. To quote Glenys Loban, an immigrant psychoanalyst who lives now in New York, but was born in South Africa, an immigrant enters her new country with one set of selves. These are then overwritten and refracted by her experiences with peers, neighbors, colleagues, authorities in the new culture, and this experience shapes her consciousness, subjectivity, and sense of identity. The choice to focus in my talk on the phenomenon of hyphenation, or its academic term of double consciousness, actually originally the term was coined by, I think, the first African American man who was the first doctorate recipient in US, but then it was borrowed by psychoanalysts, was deliberate, as it speaks, in my opinion, directly to the very precarious nature of queer migration. So on one hand, we have intense discomfort with the constant questioning, like, where are you from? And the agony of being forced to occupy the space of the hyphen, which is a well-familiar experience for the majority of queer migrants, never being seen as full citizens, never being really accepted as belonging in the UK, but instead being from somewhere else, out of place. And on the other hand, the equally intense pain experienced by the vast majority of queer people of being continuously excluded, no matter where they live, whether in the motherland for being queer or in the host country for being foreign, and simultaneously their unending, equally passionate resilience in the pursuit of affiliation, acceptance, and belonging. Their quest for interpersonal connection, so beautifully depicted by Julio Salgado on his painting, "See Me, I Am a Butterfly." Now, can we go forward to slide number 18? I'm nearly an end. When a person leaves their home, family, country, and leaves behind their mother tongue, a particular system of established sexual gender norms and rules, a person leaves behind their identity, national, familial, sexual, of gender or language, and is propelled into a seemingly permanent state of not knowing. For me, the only way of being in such terrifying and painful place was to make it into my symbolic permanent home that I furnished with uncertainty and changeability, like a nomadic tent ready to provide a shelter for a night, only to be moved again the following morning. Not knowing is a precarious and uncomfortable place to be in, even if one stumbles into it only temporarily in one's lifetime, let alone this becoming one's main locus of existence, uncertainty dominating one's experience. Not knowing is most often a source of much anxiety and can be terrifying. And yet for some people, not knowing does not prevent, but instead enables them to live their lives more fully than ever before, which is my case. Through this act of releasing one's own knowledge, long-established beliefs about people, who they are or supposed to be, all sorts of ownership and understanding of location, and at the same time remaining actively engaged in the act of living, rests the true solution to the precarious situation and dilemmas brought by queer migration. Queer migrants must, in some sense, lose themselves, give in to their existence as being marginalized and racialized for being different, and yet hold on to what seems to come so naturally to them, their unending passionate resilience in the pursuit of affiliation, acceptance, and belonging. I wish to leave you with a short story. This is slide number 15. Passage by Christine Taylor Butler, published in an amazing anthology of queer speculative fiction, Migrations, published in 2018. Let yourself be transported into a not so far away future. I'm not sure whether I've got time to read it now aloud, but you're most likely, it's sent it to you, so read it. I really suggest to you. It's a good read. Thank you.
Thank you, Piotr. I think you have a question for people to take into the small groups, don't you?
I do run it now. I forgot about the question. So the question is, imagine you are no longer able to communicate in your first language as you want to be understood. What is your experience? How would this affect you as a person?
So we will invite you to go into breakout groups now for 20 minutes. You get a little longer this time to think about that question and the rest of Piotr's very beautiful talk. And we'll see you in 20 minutes. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Piotr.